designers. Today we're going to talk about the big picture of aggregate demand and aggregate supply, and for that we should go on a big road trip. Let's talk about some big concepts here in Constitution Square, where some big things happened, like the birth of the Commonwealth of Kentucky. Speaking of big things, an economy's aggregate demand is the demand for all of the goods and services produced in the economy. The vertical axis measures the aggregate price level in the economy as determined by a price index such as the Consumer Price Index. The horizontal axis measures the real gross domestic product in the economy. The aggregate demand curve gets its downward slope from three effects: the wealth effect, the interest rate effect, and the net export effect. After I downsize my whiteboard, let's talk about the wealth effect. The wealth effect comes from the influence of price level changes on the purchasing power of consumers' money. When the price level rises, any given amount of wealth will purchase fewer goods and services, so consumers feel less wealthy and decrease their spending. Since consumer spending is part of aggregate demand, this leads to a movement along the aggregate demand curve. The interest rate effect is caused by the influence of price level changes on the interest rate and thus on investment and consumption. When the price level rises, people need more money to buy goods and services, so the demand for money increases. An increase in the demand for money is like an increase in the demand for anything else. It raises the price, and the price of money is the interest rate. When the interest rate rises, loans get more expensive, so investment and consumer spending decrease. Since investment and consumer spending are part of aggregate demand, this leads to a movement along the aggregate demand curve. The net export effect comes from the effect of price level changes on international trade. When the price level rises in the United States, imports from other countries become relatively inexpensive, so Americans import more goods and services. At the same time, U.S. goods and services become more expensive to the rest of the world, so U.S. exports decrease. The rising imports and falling exports cause a decrease in net exports and a movement along the aggregate demand curve. The aggregate demand curve looks like the demand curve for a good, but it shifts for different reasons. For example, aggregate demand will increase if expectations of a more prosperous future cause consumers to spend more now, or if increases in wealth lead consumers to increase their expenditures, or if a relatively small existing stock of physical capital necessitates large expenditures on buildings and equipment, or if the government increases its spending, or if the Federal Reserve increases the money supply, which lowers interest rates and increases investment and consumer spending. The opposite of any of these changes would cause the aggregate demand to decrease. Aggregate supply is the supply of all goods and services produced in an economy. To understand why aggregate supply is upward sloping, consider a firm that provides DJs to play music for $400 per event using labor that costs $300 per event. Suppose the firm's owners use their $100 profit per event to buy 2 pairs of jeans for $50 per pair. Now, what if the price of everything including labor increased by 50%? The price of a DJ would be $600. The firm's labor costs would be $450, and the firm's profit would be $150, with which it could still buy only 2 pairs of jeans for $75 each. Since the gain from supplying a DJ would still be 2 pairs of jeans, there would be no reason to increase the quantity supplied. Firms throughout the economy would face a similar scenario. But in reality, contracts for labor and other inputs change only every year or so, which means that the cost of labor, among other inputs, doesn't change as quickly as the overall price level. Using the cost of labor to represent a variety of input costs, let's see how slow-changing wages known as sticky wages can give the aggregate supply curve an upward slope. Suppose the 50% increase in prices affects the prices of DJs and blue jeans, but not the cost of labor. Then the DJ services firm would receive $600 per event, pay $300 for labor, and receive $300 in profit, with which it could buy 4 pairs of jeans. Due to the sticky wages, for each DJ it provided, the firm could buy more jeans than before, so it would be willing to supply more DJs at the higher price level. The same would be true for firms across the economy, so the sticky wages would cause the aggregate supply curve to be upward sloping. Now let's talk about what makes it shift. 5 types of changes can make the aggregate supply curve shift. For example, Aggregate supply will increase if the production costs fall because the price of a widely used commodity such as oil falls, or because nominal wages fall,
or because business taxes fall or business subsidies rise,
or because workers become more productive. Aggregate supply will also increase if inflation is expected to be lower than previously thought, because workers will then accept lower nominal wages, which lowers production costs. The opposite of any of these changes will cause aggregate supply to decrease. The equilibrium of aggregate demand and aggregate supply determines the price level and real GDP. In the long run, the equilibrium is on the long-run aggregate supply curve, which is vertical at an output level that we call the potential output level. The long-run aggregate supply curve is vertical because, in the long run, wages are not sticky, so changes in the price level result in changes in wages and other input prices. In that case, as we saw in the DJ services example, there is no reason for firms to supply more or less output as the price level rises or falls. That's our review of aggregate demand and aggregate supply.
We'll use this model to examine the effects of many types of macroeconomic policies and shocks to the economy.
So you'll be glad you've added it to your economic toolbox. Now that's efficiency. Safe travels.